Good day. Today, 27th September, is the last day of the referendums in the four regions of Ukraine. Well, of course, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics don't consider themselves part of Ukraine, and Russia doesn't consider them part of Ukraine either. But for simplicity, I will continue to say of Ukraine, which have been conducted with a view to deciding whether or not these regions will join Russia. And we've been getting lots of data about turnout in these regions, and in Donetsk and Lugansk regions we see overwhelming support, almost certainly rather overwhelming, huge turnout figures from the officials there. And I've no doubt that in the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics there is a genuine, massive upswing of support for union with Russia. We see rather less enthusiasm, judging by the published turnout figures, in Zaporozhye, and less enthusiasm still in Kherson region. This is exactly as I would have anticipated. But nonetheless, in every place, supposedly, turnout is high. Even in Kherson region, it'll be at least 70%, and there can be no doubt at all, in my opinion, that anybody who's voting is voting to join, voting for union with Russia. So, as of this evening, probably by the time this video is published, or soon after, there will be an official announcement that all four of these regions have voted, that the referendums in each of these regions are valid, and probably within the next few hours we will be getting an announcement that all of these regions have voted for union with Russia. And I've expressed a little cynicism about these votes, and I want to repeat again what I have said. These are very controlled votes. There's no obvious opportunity in any one of these regions, for example, to come out openly and campaign against union with Russia. I can't imagine anybody in Donetsk city, for example, coming along and openly campaigning to stick with Ukraine. So I'm not going to fall into the trap of pretending that these are pure democratic exercises. Pure democratic exercises, of course, don't exist anywhere, but there are some which more closely approximate to that, and others which approximate to it less. And I'm going to say straightforwardly, I think in this case, we can say that these probably approximate to a pure democratic exercise less. Having said that, I don't personally doubt that in Donetsk and Lugansk, these referendums reflect the actual opinions of the people there. I think Donetsk and Lugansk rose up against the government that was imposed in Kiev in 2014 after the events in Maidan, events which the Russians and I think people in Donbass construe rightly as a coup. I think they've been under relentless pressure from the Ukrainian government ever since then. They've had wars fought on their territory. I think they're totally alienated and antagonized from Ukraine, and I think that there is no doubt at all that the great majority of people, probably the overwhelming majority of people in Donbass, aspire to join Russia. The country where people speak the same language as they do, practice the same faith as they do, follow the same sort of politics as they do, and with which, to be straightforward about it, they identify and have always identified with strongly. Now, in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, I think there are probably more people who self-identify still as Ukrainians. I actually read somewhere that in a census a majority of people in Kherson region self-identified as Ukrainians, that doesn't necessarily mean that they would be averse to union with Russia. And of course, these things are malleable in this part of the world. People might identify as Ukrainians one day, change their views, say that they're Russians the next. There are lots of grey areas in between people who say they're Ukrainians but only speak Russian, who practice their religion according to the rites of the Russian Orthodox Church, but who, for various reasons over the last 30 years, have said that they're Ukrainians. And as I said, it's quite likely, very possible, that many of them will change their views. But I will say this, even though I think that there is probably more lingering pro-Ukrainian sentiment in these two regions, or perhaps, to be more accurate, less enthusiasm for union with Russia in these two regions, Zaporozhye and Kherson region, I think that probably, if this had been left open to a simple referendum, a majority would probably still have voted in favour, maybe not a big one. And once it is a done thing, it is a done thing. I don't think anybody, either in Kherson region or in Zaporozhye region, or at least maybe not anybody, but I don't think most people there, or any but a very small number of people in these two regions, will ever, once their regions have rejoined Russia, seriously contemplate rejoining Ukraine again. So we are very close now to that point where these four regions vote to join Russia. It's now openly said that in Moscow, that if they do vote to join Russia, the Russian Federation will admit them. The Russian Parliament will pass a vote overwhelmingly, perhaps even unanimously, to admit them into the Russian Federation. The President of the Russian Federation, President Putin, will address the Russian Parliament on Friday. That's the reports. And these four regions, which before the Ukrainian conflict, which began in 2014, had aggregate populations of around 9 million people, will become formally, as far as the Russians are concerned, part of Russia. Of course, very few countries around the world will recognize and acknowledge the fact. The United States and its allies will not acknowledge it, and other countries will not say they're acknowledging it either. But I'm going to make one quick observation. It will be much more difficult, far more difficult, to change perceptions globally if you had four independent republics. I mean, having four republics like Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, and trying to get countries around the world to recognize their independence would be a very hard and stony path, an uphill struggle, to put it mildly. Bluntly, if these Russian-speaking or predominantly Russian-speaking areas are reincorporated into Russia and become Russian regions, nobody around the world, not China, not India, not Indonesia, not African states or Middle Eastern states or Latin American states, none of them has to make an actual decision whether to recognize their secession from Ukraine or not. As far as they're concerned, there were previously two countries, Russia and Ukraine, and there are now still two countries, Russia and Ukraine. Whether they care much about whether Russian-speaking regions have reunited with Russia, to be straightforward about it, outside the collective West, I don't think anybody does. So actually, union with Russia from a diplomatic and foreign policy point of view is an easier sell for the Russians than independence of these regions would be. It's a fact which perhaps a lot of people don't quite get, but which I think is one that in Moscow they're very well aware of, and I think it's inconceivable that they haven't taken soundings and spoken to their friends in China and India, and that they haven't worked this out already. So these regions will then join Russia. And we now have some indications about what happens next, because the head of the Crimean government, a man called Aksyonov, who is of course an official of the Russian state, has now said that once these regions have joined Russia, on the assumption that the war continues, which of course it will, then we will have no more special military operation. That will be obviously no longer valid, because that was a special military operation launched to assist the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, defend themselves from Ukrainian or alleged Ukrainian military aggression. So the special military operation will end, because those two republics as independent republics will no longer exist, and in replacement of that special military operation there is going to be a counter-terrorist operation. You may remember that's something we were talking about a lot on the Duran and on this channel a few days ago, before the referendums were announced. I rather thought that union with Russia would mean that we were no longer going to have an issue of a counter-terrorist operation, but that's apparently the option that the Russian authorities are going to go for. So a counter-terrorism operation to secure these regions of Russia. Now, that actually has some rather interesting implications, because, of course, if you follow its logic through, then it would imply that from a Russian perspective, the leaders of the Ukrainian government, President Zelensky, General Zaluzhny, Foreign Minister Kuleba, all of these other people who are engaging or who are fighting or who are seeking to fight to regain control of these four regions, that they are in effect terrorists. Now, that does have some rather serious implications. It means, for example, that they are fair game, at least from a Russian perspective, for the Russian security services, for the Russian security and defense agencies. They could, in theory, come after them. Well, I'm going to hold back and will discuss the contours of any counter-terrorist operation that emerges from these votes once it's announced. So far, it hasn't been. We've had Aksyonov telling us that it's on the cards. He's a person who presumably would know, but we'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, all of this, of course, happening even as the Russian military is gradually building up its combat power, as the partial mobilization grinds on. And again, I'm going to just repeat what I've said on previous occasions. There's a huge amount of coverage in the Western media about the problems with this partial mobilization. And there's also, by the way, a lot of coverage about this in the Russian media too. Coverage which, it may surprise people to know, the Kremlin itself has actually been encouraging. They've actually basically told Russian journalists to go out, and Russian civil society organizations to go out, track down wherever there's real problems with the partial mobilization, find out if people are being enlisted who shouldn't be enlisted, and sort out any problems like that. And a number of Russian officials around the country who've been involved in that partial mobilization have actually been sacked because they've overstepped the limit in some ways. We've even seen some Russian ministries join in all of this, so that the Agriculture Ministry has asked that key farm workers should not be enlisted because they're needed in order to bring in the harvest. And the Digital Resources Ministry in Russia has complained about the fact that there's been attempts to recruit IT specialists, even though on the list of categories of people who should not be enlisted, IT specialists are specifically included. Now, of course, all of this has played wonderfully into the Western media, but I think the reason that this has happened, the reason that the Kremlin itself has been encouraging this, is that they want to make absolutely sure that the people who are indeed enlisted and who are brought into the military are people who really want to be there or are willing to be there and can be used effectively in the fighting which is to come. And I have no doubt overall that this partial mobilization has been going ahead on a reasonably stable basis. It'll probably take a couple more days for it to be completed. We don't know yet the total number of troops or personnel who've been drafted in, but sooner or later, fairly soon I suspect, the process will have run its course. The people will be sent to the training camps. We'll start to see some of them inserted into various units around the country, around Russia. Others perhaps will be trained up to reconstitute entire new units, but I doubt that it's going to take quite as many months for these people to appear on the battlefields as has been suggested before by various people, because, as I've said previously, most of these people who are being enlisted now are people who are close to the military, who have already received training fairly recently, and who are simply going to need some degree of refreshing courses in order to make them once more effective soldiers. At which point, of course, Ukraine will have lost that numerical superiority on the battlefield, which has been its one single advantage in the war. Anyway, that brings me to the actual state of the war now. And it seems to me that fighting is now going on essentially in just three places. Firstly, there is the ring road, the areas around Donetsk city, these heavily fortified positions which the Ukrainians built up over the 8 years of the conflict, and which, starting with the fall of Pesky, the Russians have been steadily working through. I say the Russians, actually it's overwhelmingly the Donetsk militia. And what has been happening over the last couple of days is that Ukraine has been launching counterattack after counterattack to try to recover ground that is lost in this area, even as the militia, in fact, continues its advance. The result has been exceptionally heavy fighting, with the Russian artillery used at a very intense levels, and with Ukrainian losses apparently extraordinarily high. I said in a previous program that I thought the place where the losses are probably highest at the moment in the war, not in Kherson region, but in Bakhmut and the fighting around Bakhmut. I'm going to revise my view. I think the heaviest losses probably are those in the fighting around Donetsk city. Here again, I'm going to state my long-standing view. I do not understand this Ukrainian obsession with trying to hold on to these positions around Donetsk city. One way or the other, the Russians, or rather the militia, cracked these defenses back in August. And they're pushing forward and they're gradually unrolling them up. For Ukraine to try to hold on to these places, for Ukraine worse still, to try to recapture these places is, it seems to me, an act of folly. It is simply to throw men and machines once more into the inferno of the Russian artillery. And I say inferno because here again the Russians are very active with their TOS-1 thermobaric multiple rocket launch systems, which anybody who's seen pictures of them in use, well, they will know what terrifying weapons they actually are. So I don't understand at all the logic of this. I would have thought a more sensible thing would be to withdraw Ukrainian forces from the areas around Donetsk and perhaps concentrate them somewhere more defensible, perhaps try to reinforce the defences in Bakhmut city itself. And since I'm on the topic now of Bakhmut city, since I made my last programme, there's been a cascade of news of the Wagner organisation making heavy inroads, capturing large areas of the southern suburbs, storming not just Zaitsevo but other parts of these suburbs. We're getting now very close to that point, I think, where Bakhmut city itself starts to look increasingly undefendable. Now, that doesn't mean that the fighting in Bakhmut city is going to end anytime soon. The persistent pattern of this war is that the Ukrainian military, locks itself into fortified positions, sacrifices its mobility, is unable to conduct any kind of mobile defense, throws away huge numbers of lives of its people, risks sometimes encirclement, as happened decisively in Mariupol and came very close to happening in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and as a result suffers horrendous losses. And it seems to me the same pattern is repeating itself in Bakhmut city. I don't know whether General Zaluzhny, whom I'm going to come to in a moment, is once more advising President Zelensky to pull Ukrainian forces out of Bakhmut city. If he is, I'm sure that his advice once more is ignored, and we see that here, as in the areas around Donetsk city, the Ukrainians have chosen to cling on, accept these horrific losses, and cling on to little real purpose that I can see. I would add that if we're talking about the imminent autumn rains and things of this kind, I would have thought that this would make impossible or very difficult Ukrainian offensives, armoured offensives in regions like Kherson region or the Liman area, which I'm going to come to shortly. But it will not affect these Russian advances in places like Bakhmut city or Donetsk city. And I think that before very long, once these rains come, we're going to see a period when the war is going to revert to the pattern that had become established between April and the end of August, when all the fighting was essentially in Donbass, and we saw the slow motion, incremental, relentless Russian advance through Donbass, with settlement after settlement being taken, with Ukraine suffering horrific losses, with Ukraine losing cities and towns and thousands of troops, and eventually the process of Donbass being cleared, being brought to a conclusion. When the period of the mud ends, then we might see some sort of a reversion to a more mobile type of war. But I expect that at that point, the nature of that war will be different. And now that brings me to the last area where the fighting still continues, and this is Liman or Krasny Liman. And as I've said in previous programs, this appears to be the last area where Ukraine is continuing with its offensive. That offensive that it launched all across the battlefields back in September, and which seems to have ebbed pretty much everywhere, but which continues to be pursued against Liman. And as I've said in previous programs, that offensive towards Liman appears to have been intended as a pathway in order to launch some kind of renewed offensive, some kind of attack on northern Lugansk region. That's now looking all but impossible, but nonetheless, the Ukrainian forces still seem to be persisting in these attacks on Liman, long after the strategic purpose of those attacks seems to have gone. One gets the impression that there's now very heavy fighting going on around Liman, that Ukraine sends armoured columns across the steppe lands. This is again largely open country, towards Liman from various directions. And again, they run up against Russian artillery, the densities of which seem to be steadily increasing in this area as well. There's something else, however, which is now starting to happen, and which some commentators on the Russian side are talking about, which is they say that these Ukrainian attempts to try to surround, to encircle Liman, mean that Ukraine has pushed its forces forward along very, very narrow fronts, capturing a few villages along the way. And the result is that these Ukrainian forces are becoming isolated from their bases and their supply lines, and are becoming ripe for Russian counterattacks and encirclements. And there's even some talk about cauldrons starting to emerge in this area, of Ukrainian forces increasingly isolated from the main Ukrainian positions, remote from those positions, becoming surrounded by Russian troops and being cut off from resupply, and eventually forced to surrender and to be defeated. Well, I'm not going to say whether that is indeed what's going to happen, and I'm not going to say either whether that is the Russian plan, whether the Russians are indeed considering counterattacks, encirclement operations of that nature. What I would say is that if this is indeed what does happen, then it is an almost exact repeat of what happened in the fighting in this part of Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. On both occasions, in 2014 and in 2015, Ukraine sent armoured columns advancing over very narrow fronts, and on both occasions those armoured columns became encircled. In the first case, in the summer of 2014, in a place called Ilovaisk, and in the second case, in 2015, in a place called Debaltseve. And Ukraine suffered extremely heavy losses as a result of those operations. In fact, the Debaltseve grouping was only saved from complete annihilation as a result of diplomatic action by Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, which eventually led, by the way, to the Minsk agreement, which, as we know, was never implemented. But never mind. What I would say about that was this: when those two operations, Ilovaisk and Debaltseve, took place, I was already following the Ukrainian conflict with some interest, And I got the clear impression that what was happening then was that the political leadership in Kiev, at that time that meant President Poroshenko, had essentially wrested control of the war from the Ukrainian military leadership, and seeking quick victories or decisive victories, had launched those operations in that particular way towards Ilovaisk and Debaltseve in ways that rendered Ukrainian troops vulnerable to encirclement, which is of course what happened. And I can't help but think that we're perhaps looking at exactly the same thing again, that the Ukrainian military leadership has been pushed aside, and the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, and his team have now come to see the recapture of Liman, or of Krasny Liman, as some great objective in itself. And the result is that they're pushing Ukrainian forces in ways that are becoming increasingly dangerous and risky for those forces. As the French like to say, the more things change, the more they remain the same. Another Ukrainian president, Zelensky, may be repeating the same things that the previous Ukrainian president, the same mistakes that the previous Ukrainian president, President Poroshenko, made. Anyway, that now brings me back to the topic of General Zaluzhny, which is that, as some people may have noticed, General Zaluzhny is now being massively built up by the Western media. He's now on the cover of Time magazine, which has published a long piece about him, which, by the way, denies that there's any tensions between him and President Zelensky. Now, that may or may not be the case, but I will say this. There are some commentators on the Russian side, including a very senior Russian official at Zaporozhye region, who are pointing to these latest attempts to puff up General Zaluzhny, which are taking place in the Western media, as indicators that there may be some people in Washington who are starting to think that President Zelensky is past his sell-by date and that it's time to build up some other Ukrainian official to take his place. And that might be General Zaluzhny. Well, I have no idea one way or the other. I do note with some interest the fact that General Zaluzhny is getting all this favourable publicity. I wonder why, but I'm not going to comment further upon things I really don't know very much about. All I will say is this: if there is a decision, which can only be in Washington, that President Zelensky has become a problem and that the time has come to replace him with someone else, and General Zaluzhny might be an obvious possibility, if that decision has been made, then whoever is making it in Washington is making a huge mistake. I think that leveraging Zelensky out of power would demolish whatever legitimacy and authority the Ukrainian government still has in the eyes of the Ukrainian people. Anyway, that's all I get to say about that. As all of these things go on the battlefields, as the referendums and the mobilization grinds on, diplomacy is indeed back at work. Now, I've spoken a great deal in recent programs about rumors about a Saudi mediation exercise. And surprise, surprise, we have now had a telephone conversation between President Putin and President Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. Now, this conversation took place on the 22nd of September. I probably missed it, but it is an interesting conversation because it does give us a sense of where Saudi policy is heading. And I'm going to just mention it. I'm going to just, first of all, read the Kremlin's readout, which is quite interesting. And I want to stress again, this is a conversation that took place some days ago, 5 days ago. So it's not a recent conversation, but it is one which I had previously overlooked and which I do think nonetheless is interesting. Anyway, this is what the Kremlin readout says. Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation with Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud at the Saudi side's initiative. Now, this is an extremely friendly call, as we will see. But it's also interesting that the Russians have made it clear that it's the Saudis who initiated the call. And one wonders why. One wonders why the Russians wanted to signal to the world that it was MBS who decided to call Putin. Well, I'm going to make one guess, which is that the Russians wanted to contrast the fact that MBS was able to pick up the telephone and talk to Putin at a time when there are multiple reports that President Macron of France also tried to pick up the telephone and talk to Putin, but was unable to do so. That the Russians refused to hold a conversation between Putin and Macron at roughly the same time that they were happy to have a conversation between Putin and MBS. So that would be quite a studied, I was going to say insult, but of course not quite an insult. But anyway, it's quite a calculated put down of Macron. It's not one that's obvious, but I'm pretty sure that Macron must be steaming over this. But anyway, put that aside. I think there is another reason, which is that the Russians want to publicize the fact that it's the Saudis who are calling them, because they want to reinforce the point that the Saudis are anxious to maintain their friendship with Russia. In other words, that it's the Saudis who are driving this friendship, not the Russians. Anyway, to continue with what the readout says. Vladimir Putin asked Prince Mohammed bin Salman to convey his best regards and good wishes to King Salman bin Abdul Aziz Al Saud and congratulations to the Saudi authorities and people on the 90th anniversary of the establishment of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, marked on September 23rd. The two leaders discussed various matters pertaining to their cooperation at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the context of the decision adopted at the recent Samarkand summit to grant the status of dialogue partner to Saudi Arabia. Prince Mohammed bin Salman mentioned the SCO's growing role in international affairs and expressed Saudi Arabia's willingness to take an active part in its work. In other words, Saudi Arabia wants to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Russia supports its application. Translated into normal English, that's what those paragraphs say. And then we come to another interesting paragraph. They talked about Russia-Saudi Arabia coordination to ensure stability on the global oil market, expressed a high appreciation of the efforts taken within the framework of OPEC Plus, and reaffirmed their commitment to implement the agreements reached. So the Russian-Saudi oil alliance remains intact and strong, which by extension means that the Saudis are not going to support this this G7 price cap on Russian oil, which some reports are now suggesting is going to come into effect in February. At least the G7 is planning to bring into effect in February. I've always said that the Saudis would oppose this scheme. They do not want to surrender control of the oil market to the United States and its friends, the oil price to the United States and its friends. And we have further confirmation of this. Prince Mohammed bin Salman said that Saudi Arabia would be adequately represented at the Russian Energy Week International Forum, which is scheduled to take place in Moscow on October 12th to 14th. So the Saudis are not boycotting Russia. They continue with their economic and a diplomatic coordination with the Russians. He, that's to say MBS, expressed satisfaction with the transfer of foreign prisoners who illegally took part in hostilities in Donbass, which became possible thanks to the personal mediation of the Crown Prince. So we see that one reason why that rather controversial exchange of prisoners was agreed to by the Russians was that MBS himself played a personal role in arranging the exchange. That would have made it very difficult for the Russians to reject MBS's request for the release of these people, but we can already see what the Russians are getting from that. They've already got Saudi commitment to continue with the Russian-Saudi oil price alliance, and of course the Saudis are also going to attend this energy conference in Moscow. And then it finishes during the exchange of views on the bilateral agenda. The sides noted that their trade and economic ties were growing at a high pace and that mutually beneficial cooperation was developing in widely different areas. It was agreed to maintain interaction and personal contacts. So very friendly call. Now, no hint here that there is an actual Saudi mediation proposal to bring the conflict itself to an end, but neither is this readout inconsistent with that being the case. We'll just have to wait and see. But it's clear that the Saudis and the Russians are talking very warmly with each other at the very highest levels. And whether there is a Saudi peace proposal in the works, well, we'll just have to wait and see. Now, possibly prompted by the rumours that there might be a Saudi peace proposal, we've also had another personage from this part of the world, President Erdogan, have a conversation with Putin. Now, I don't yet have the Kremlin's readout. I will cover that in my next video. But we do have an interesting summary from the Russian news agency TASS. Now, this is a much more recent call, one which may have happened either yesterday or today. And this is what TASS reports. In a conversation with Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that Russia remained ready for negotiations with Ukraine, but as the situation changes, their conditions also change. Russian presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov told the media on Tuesday. The president said that, of course, Russia remains ready to negotiate, but as the situation changes, so do the conditions, Peskov said. Earlier, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu said that in a conversation with Erdogan in Samarkand, Putin admitted that a resumption of the dialogue with Kiev remained a possibility. The Kremlin spokesman said that with regard to negotiations, the principles remained unchanged. Putin asked Erdogan to remember that it was the Ukrainian side that had abandoned the negotiating track. In general, the the principle remains the same, just as all goals of the special military operation. It was also stated at the talks that the Ukrainian side had completely left the negotiating track. For this reason, the special military operation continues, Peskov said. So, what Putin said to Erdogan is, look, it's not, we understand that you want to continue in your role as mediator. We're not averse to negotiations with the Ukrainians. We've never been averse to negotiations with the Ukrainians. Back in March, on the 29th of March, in Istanbul, we almost came to an agreement with them. And this was as a result of a mediation which you, yourself, President Erdogan, chaired. There was a meeting in Istanbul which you chaired, and the Ukrainians came along with proposals, and we were attracted by those proposals, and we said that we looked favourably on these proposals, and we made counter proposals to build on the concessions that the Ukrainians had made. But then the Ukrainians pulled out. They took back all the concessions that they had made. They started talking about victory on the battlefield. And if the Ukrainians now want to come back and negotiate, if you could persuade them to come back and negotiate, well, we are happy. We are absolutely willing to engage with them. But they must understand that if that happens, there can be no return to the position that was agreed or almost agreed in Istanbul, and which Ukraine itself threw away. This time, the Ukrainians will be faced with a fait accompli, with Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson part of the Russian Federation, and there can be no retreat from that position. That is constitutionally impossible, because the Russian constitution does not allow for the cession of Russian territory. Now, what Erdogan is going to do, I have absolutely no idea. There's long been a historic rivalry between Erdogan and MBS. Quite likely he will come up with some kind of proposal of his own. I think the Russians will listen, and they will hear whatever Erdogan comes up with, whatever MBS comes up with. It's not impossible that the Russians will play around with both proposals, play Erdogan and MBS to some extent off against each other, and we will see what comes. Now, I've said many times, I'm going to say it again, it is urgently in Ukraine's interests to negotiate and to seek a stable and secure peace. It will have to make fundamental concessions, bigger concessions than it made in Istanbul back in March. But that is the result of it listening to bad counsel from people like Boris Johnson, who told Ukraine to fight on. Thousands, tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives have been lost because Ukraine decided to listen to that advice. The Ukrainian economy has been further devastated. More Ukrainian territory has been lost, and the Russians have now said that they're not prepared to give up Kherson and Zaporozhye region, because so far as the Russians are concerned, these territories are now part of Russia. If Ukraine doesn't negotiate now, however, then it faces the prospect in a few weeks, months' time, that the Russians will have advanced even deeper into Ukraine. Perhaps they will have reached the Dnieper River. Perhaps they will have attacked and captured Nikolaev itself, the city that stands between the Russians and Odessa. And the Russians have hinted that they might actually have interests in Nikolaev. The territories of Nikolaev region, which are under Russian control, are also conducting referendums to join Russia, technically as part of Kherson region. But you can easily see how the Russians could continue this process of capturing territory, holding referendums, assimilating that territory into Russia, pushing on until Odessa itself is reached, and perhaps other places too. But one way or the other, Ukraine needs to start thinking about peace. I have to say, though, that I personally don't think that the Ukrainians will seek peace in this way. And I think that especially after the debacle of March, I don't think Putin himself is particularly interested in peace with Ukraine. He doesn't want to shut the door on negotiations, because doing so would unsettle his friends in India and China, in Saudi Arabia and Turkey. But neither do I think does he expect negotiations to succeed. I think Putin is now in that position where he's happy to make reasonable sounding proposals to the Ukrainians, having set out what his own red lines are. He's interested in talking about negotiations. He's willing to discuss peace with the Ukrainians, but he's doing so in the knowledge that the Ukrainians themselves will never agree. Now, this is not unlike the strategy of another lawyer politician who became president. As I've said many times, the fact that Putin is a trained lawyer is something that people consistently overlook in the discussions about him, even though it is a central part of the way in which he conducts himself and has governed Russia. Well, another lawyer politician found himself in a not entirely dissimilar position, and that of course was Lincoln during the American Civil War. And he too used to constantly hold out the hand, supposedly towards the South. He was always willing, as he said, to talk, to make peace, and much of what he said was extremely conciliatory towards the South, or appeared to be so. But I think that, like Putin today, I think Lincoln always at the back of his mind believed that the South would never agree to any of the kind of terms, however reasonable they appeared, which he Lincoln, appeared to be offering to them. And I think that beyond a certain point, Lincoln, like Putin, continued to hold out these offers, less because he really wanted or expected the war to end through negotiations, but more because he realized, or came to realize, that by appearing reasonable, he was making his adversary appear unreasonable in the eyes of constituencies, important constituencies that mattered. In Lincoln's case, those constituencies were, of course, in the United States itself. In Putin's case, they are with his international partners. So the result was that the war dragged on until eventually, in the case of the United States, it ended with a complete US victory, complete victory for the North. And I suspect something similar is going to happen with this war in Ukraine as well. I would add that just as Lincoln and Putin are both lawyers, so this is a very standard tactic that good litigation lawyers use, which is to make reasonable proposals to the other side in the knowledge that the other side is going to reject them. That obviously makes your opponent look unreasonable, and it solidifies your own position. Well, having said that, let me say again, it is Ukraine's choice. It may be very difficult for President Zelensky himself to reach out and negotiate now. Perhaps General Zaluzhny might do so, assuming he does take over. I would say that what I know of General Zaluzhny makes me think that's unlikely, by the way. I get the sense that he's every bit as committed to the project of Ukraine as Zelensky and Poroshenko and all the others are. And I find it very difficult to imagine Zaluzhny coming to any kind of negotiated settlement with the Russians, but who knows? But regardless, difficult as it is, it remains Ukraine's choice. Options for negotiation are still there. Opportunities for negotiation are still there. It's a question of whether or not Ukraine will seize them. I don't think it will, even though the clock, it seems to me, is now definitely ticking, and even though the hands of the clock are approaching the midnight hour for Ukraine. Well, that's as far as I'm going to go today. More from me soon. I hope you've gained something new from this program. We'll see what happens on the battlefields, whether the Wagner group storms Bakhmut over the next few days, whether the Ukrainians achieve some kind of breakthrough in Liman, or whether they're encircled instead, and whether these negotiations achieve any result. I've not said anything in this program about the economic situation, which perhaps I should do. There was a disastrously failed treasury bond sale the other day, which in my opinion is perhaps the single most important piece of economic news of all. There's the well-known problems in Britain to discuss as well, but I'm going to leave those to another program. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, Locals, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, and of course on Locals I'm still hoping to be able to do a live stream tomorrow at some time, but that will depend very much, I'm afraid, on whether my cold continues to abate. As you can tell from my voice, I'm still very afflicted by it. Anyway, thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find us on those other platforms. Remember, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Also, you should check out our shop and buy the amazing things you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, please, if you've liked this video, press the like button and join and check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.